General Anthony Croft believed orbital fire was the ultimate cleanser. Scorched earth was his specialty, and the independent human colony of Oakhaven was supposed to be just another lesson in obedience. But when the Federation turned their home to glass, they didn't kill the resistance. They accidentally gave it immortality. The sky above Kepler 186f did not bleed. It simply ignited. Oakhaven was a quiet agricultural settlement, an independent frontier town, clinging to the edge of the habitable zone. To the casual observer, it was a throwback to simpler times, a place where men and women worked the red soil with heavy machinery and calloused hands. They traded grain, cultivated biosynthetic crops, and asked only to be left alone by the sprawling, tyrannical reach of the Federation of Earth. General Anthony Croft had other plans. Croft was a company man through and through, a high-ranking officer whose career was sponsored by the deep pockets of real-world defense monoliths, Lockheed Martin, Exoplanetary, and General Dynamics. The Federation demanded exorbitant tithes from the frontier worlds to fuel their endless expansion, and when Mayor Charles Reed of Oakhaven politely but firmly refused the latest tax hike, Croft was sent to make an example of them. "Rebellion is a disease," Croft noted in his official log, sitting comfortably on the bridge of the dreadnought USS Sovereign, in low orbit above the colony. "The only cure is cauterization, down on the surface." Charles Reed stood on the porch of the town hall. He was a broad-shouldered man with a salt and pepper beard, holding a cup of synth-caff as he looked up at the artificial star suddenly burning in the twilight sky. Beside him stood Dr. Evelyn Shaw. Officially, Evelyn was Oakhaven's lead botanist, tasked with adapting Terran wheat to the harsh Kepler soil. Unofficially, she was a ghost. Decades ago, she had been a lead engineer for DARPA's Black Sky initiative, a top-secret bioweapons and nanotechnology division that had been abruptly shut down when its creations were deemed too apocalyptic for civilized warfare. "They're charging the main batteries, Charles," Evelyn said, her voice devoid of panic, though her knuckles were white as she gripped the porch rail. "I know," Charles replied softly. "Are the vaults sealed?" "Sealed and primed. The civilian evacuation into the deep-crust bunkers was completed an hour ago. It's just you, me, and the volunteers left on the surface." Evelyn adjusted her glasses, looking out over the wooden houses, the sprawling fields, and the heavy automated tractors resting in the barns. "It seems a shame to lose the town. We built this with our own hands." "We built it as a stage, Evelyn. Let Croft drop the curtain." In orbit, Croft gave the order. The orbital strike did not fall like rain. It descended like a hammer of pure, unadulterated wrath. Kinetic tungsten rods, superheated by atmospheric entry, slammed into the Earth with the force of tactical nuclear warheads. Following the kinetic bombardment came the plasma lances. The air in Oakhaven instantly reached 5,000 degrees. Wooden structures didn't just burn, they vaporized. The metal frames of the heavy tractors melted into glowing puddles of slag. The soil itself flash-boiled, turning the sprawling fields of golden grain into a sea of churning, screaming fire. Charles and Evelyn were vaporized in a fraction of a millisecond, feeling no pain, completely obliterated by the sheer kinetic and thermal energy of the strike. To the sensors aboard the Sovereign, the town of Oakhaven simply ceased to exist. Croft watched the holomap on his bridge as the thermal blooming finally began to subside, leaving a crater of cooling obsidian glass 2 miles wide. "Target destroyed," his tactical officer reported. "0 life signs detected. Complete eradication achieved." "Good," Croft smiled coldly. "Send the footage to the rest of the sector. Let them see what happens when you defy the Federation." The fleet jumped out of the system, leaving the Kepler colony a blackened, smoking scar. They thought the story ended there. They thought they had burned the village to the bedrock and scattered its ashes to the solar winds. But the Federation of Earth, in their arrogance, failed to understand the true nature of Evelyn Shaw's work at DARPA. She hadn't come to Oakhaven to grow wheat. She had come to plant a garden of a very different kind. Deep beneath the cooling glass, buried in the bedrock where the plasma fire had superheated the Earth, microscopic machines awoke. Evelyn's masterpiece, codenamed the Phoenix Strain, was a self-replicating nanite colony designed to remain dormant indefinitely. It had only one activation trigger: an extreme, catastrophic thermal event. The orbital strike wasn't an execution, it was an ignition. The nanites fed on the ambient heat, using the massive thermal battery of the scorched Earth to power their initial replication cycle. They needed raw materials, and the blast had provided them in abundance. The carbonized remains of the crops, the melted titanium and steel of the tractors, the pulverized silica of the soil, and yes, even the molecular carbon remains of Charles, Evelyn, and the brave volunteers. It was all harvested. In the absolute silence of the dead valley, beneath a sky choked with ash, the ground began to whisper. The ash wasn't blowing away, it was anchoring. The molecular structures of the scorched Earth began to rewrite themselves. Nobody noticed what was growing in the ashes, because it didn't look like life. It looked like cooling glass. But beneath the surface, a synthetic root system was spreading, hungry for iron, hungry for energy, and carrying a digitized, singular directive: rebuild, evolve, avenge. 3 months later, the Federation dreadnought Sovereign returned to Kepler 186F. The frontier systems had been uncharacteristically quiet since the destruction of Oakhaven. General Croft, believing his brutal tactic had successfully cowed the outer colonies into submission, decided it was time to establish a permanent military installation on the planet. The site of Oakhaven was chosen specifically for its psychological impact. Building a fortress on the glassed graves of rebels was a statement that could not be misunderstood. Captain Richard Hayes, a seasoned veteran of the Federation's planetary assault divisions, was given command of the ground operation. He led a detachment of 300 engineers, heavy combat mechs, and a fleet of automated construction drones down to the surface. When the dropships touched down on the perimeter of the blast zone, the massive thrusters kicked up clouds of fine, pale dust. Hayes stepped off the ramp, his boots crunching against the black, vitrified earth. "Secure the perimeter," Hayes barked over the comms. "Set up the portable generators and get the atmospheric scrubbers running. I want the foundation for the command center laid by tomorrow morning." The landscape was deeply unsettling. A perfectly flat expanse of black, mirror-like glass stretched for nearly 2 miles in every direction, its polished surface reflecting the pale sky with unnatural clarity. Surrounding it, the charred, petrified remains of an alien forest, the blackened trunks, frozen forever in twisted, skeletal shapes, as though an unimaginable inferno had swept through and turned the entire wilderness to stone in a single instant. Not a breeze stirred. Not a single living creature moved. The silence was absolute, oppressive enough to make every breath feel too loud. It was broken only by the steady hum of the Federation's fusion generators and the heavy, rhythmic thud of the towering combat mechs as they patrolled the edge of the lifeless zone, their sensors constantly sweeping for threats that refused to reveal themselves. For the first 48 hours, everything proceeded according to standard operating procedure. But on the third day, the anomalies began. It started small. Sergeant David Collins, the unit's chief mechanic, reported unexplainable power drains in the heavy construction drones. "It's the damnedest thing, Captain," David said, wiping a mixture of sweat and pale ash from his forehead. "The lithium-ion reserves are dropping by 20% every night, and there's this dust. It gets into everything." Hayes looked at the drone. A thin layer of pale grey ash coated the joints of the machine. "Clean the filters, Sergeant. We are sitting in a giant ashtray. Of course there's dust." "That's just it, sir," David muttered, leaning in closer. "I tried to blow it off with the compressed air hoses. It doesn't move. It's magnetized to the chassis. I had to scrape it off with a sonic chisel, and even then the metal underneath looked pitted, like it had been etched with acid." Hayes dismissed the concern as environmental hazards, but the unease in the camp grew. The temperature in the valley was steadily dropping, defying the planet's normal climate models. It was as if the ground itself was actively absorbing the ambient heat. On the fifth night, the silence of the valley was broken by a screech of tearing metal. Hayes burst from his command tent with his sidearm already drawn, expecting an enemy assault. Instead, he found the engineering bay engulfed in confusion. Technicians shouted over one another, alarms blared from every direction, and soldiers stumbled backward in panic, unable to explain what they were seeing. In the center of the camp stood one of the massive 20-ton combat mechs, a towering bipedal war machine manufactured by Raytheon Stellar. Normally, its reactor hummed with immense power, but now it stood perfectly still, every light extinguished, as though its systems had been drained in an instant. Inside the sealed cockpit, the pilot, a young corporal named Jenkins, pounded desperately against the reinforced glass with both fists. His mouth was wide open in a silent scream, his terrified eyes locked on the soldiers outside, but no sound escaped the lifeless machine. "What the hell is going on?" Hayes shouted, running toward the mech. "The power plant just died," David yelled over the confusion, holding a diagnostic pad that was flashing wildly. "But that's not possible. The fusion core is fully loaded." Hayes reached the mech and shone his flashlight up at the chassis. His blood ran cold. The pale ash that covered the ground hadn't just settled on the machine. It had climbed it. Vein-like structures of shimmering, metallic dust were crawling up the mech's legs, weaving themselves into the microseams of the armor plating. As Hayes watched, horrified, the thick titanium plating of the mech's left leg simply dissolved into a cloud of grey dust, absorbed into the crawling mass. The machine groaned, shifting its weight as its structural integrity was eaten away at a molecular level. "Get him out of there!" Hayes roared. David and two other engineers scrambled up the emergency ladder, violently prying the manual release hatch of the cockpit open. They dragged the terrified pilot out just as the mech's entire lower half crumbled into ash. The upper torso crashed to the glass floor with a deafening boom, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. But the dust didn't settle. Instead, it swirled in the beam of the floodlights, defying gravity. It began to coalesce, drawing more and more material from the black glass floor. The ground beneath their feet was vibrating, emitting a low, subwoofer hum that rattled the teeth in Hayes's skull. "Captain!" David screamed, pointing toward the center of the blast zone. Hayes turned. The portable generators were dead. The camp was plunged into darkness, save for the emergency chemical flares. By their red, flickering light, Hayes saw the impossible. The glassed earth was shifting. It was moving like a liquid, rising up in jagged, geometric pillars. The Phoenix strain had spent 3 months feeding on the heat of the orbital strike, replicating in the billions, laying a vast underground network. Now it had tasted Federation technology. It had analyzed the mech's armor, its fusion core, its weaponry, and it had adapted. Structures were growing out of the ground, not houses or barns, but towering spires of dark, fractal metal. The ashes of Oakhaven were rebuilding the town, but the blueprints had been twisted by the violence of its destruction. A shadow moved at the edge of the flare light. Hayes raised his rifle, his hands trembling. "Who's there? Identify yourself." From the swirling cloud of metallic ash, a figure stepped forward. It was perfectly human in its proportions, but entirely constructed of shifting, razor-sharp nanite clusters. Its face was a featureless mask of dark metal, save for 2 glowing, predatory red optics. But the voice that emanated from it, the voice made Hayes drop his weapon. It was a perfect, digitized synthesis of Mayor Charles Reed. "You burned our homes, Captain," the entity said, its voice echoing not only from the towering figure before them, but also from the ground beneath their boots, as though the entire valley had found its own voice. "You gave us fire. We thank you for the fuel." A wave of terrified silence lasted only a heartbeat before chaos erupted. All around the camp, the earth split open with thunderous cracks. Rivers of black ash surged upward like monstrous tidal waves, twisting into living storms that swallowed barricades, vehicles, and panicked soldiers alike. Desperate screams filled the air as the Federation outpost disappeared beneath the relentless tide. Every escape route vanished in seconds. Oakhaven had returned, not as a forgotten settlement, but as a living force of vengeance, and this time it had no intention of letting a single invader escape its harvest. Light years away, in the sterile, heavily fortified command center of the Federation High Command, General Anthony Croft watched the telemetry feed from Kepler 186F go permanently dark. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the edge of his mahogany desk, a relic imported from Earth, staring at the static on the primary display. Captain Hayes's final transmission had been a chaotic mess of screaming, tearing metal and static. But the visual data captured in the final seconds was what truly disturbed the intelligence analysts. The analysts, contracted from Palantir Deep Space Solutions, were running the fractured footage through enhancement algorithms. The resulting projection hovered in the center of the briefing room. It showed the Raytheon stellar mech dissolving into metallic dust, the ground rising up in sharp, unnatural geometries, and most chilling of all, the digitized silhouette of Charles Reed. "General," began Dr. Aris Thorne. "No, strike that, Dr. Aris Corbin, the lead synthetic biologist from the Northrop Grumman Aerospace Division. This isn't a localized rebellion. We are looking at a Class 9 von Neumann event, a self-replicating machine swarm." Croft narrowed his eyes. "A grey goo scenario? I thought those were banned under the Geneva Accords." "They are. But this isn't random consumption, General. It's directed. It's architectural." Corbin pulled up a complex thermodynamic model on the secondary screen. "The swarm's replication rate is exponential, but it operates on a highly specific thermal mass equation. Our sensors recorded the ambient energy drop just before Hayes lost contact. Corbin highlighted a formula glowing in the holotank.
Darsot.
Frac. Partial. Partial. Planasan nabla. Math B. Gamma. T. Sidot. XP left. Frac. Delta. Eta. KBT asis. Right. This equation models their growth, Corbin explained. The density of the nanite mass, taurodalul, over time isn't just absorbing matter. It's actively converting the kinetic and thermal energy of our own weapons, represented by delta EA fall, to overcome their replication threshold. In layman's terms, General, when you glassed Oakhaven, you gave them the exact activation energy they needed to wake up. And when Hayes brought down a fusion-powered outpost, he brought them breakfast. Croft rose slowly from his command chair, his jaw locked so tightly that the muscles in his face twitched. Losing a remote frontier garrison had already been humiliating. Losing it to the ghosts of a town he had publicly condemned and believed he had erased from history would be nothing less than political suicide. The Senate would demand answers, his rivals would smell weakness, and decades of carefully cultivated authority would collapse overnight. I don't care about their math, Doctor, he said coldly, cutting off the scientist's objections. I care about destroying them. If they feed on energy, we'll starve them. If they feed on metal, we'll give them nothing but plasma. He turned toward the tactical officers, his eyes blazing with determination. Ready the first armada. I want a Boeing SpaceX Dreadnought strike group fully mobilized and spun up within the hour. While Croft marshaled the absolute pinnacle of human destructive capability, Kepler 186F was undergoing a silent, terrifying metamorphosis. The ashes of Oakhaven had not stopped at consuming Captain Hayes and his engineers. Having tasted the heavily encrypted data cores of the Federation dropships and the fusion reactors of the mechs, the Phoenix strain evolved. Evelyn Shaw's brilliant, vindictive programming had merged with the harvested neural patterns of the town's dead. The swarm was no longer just an AI. It was a localized hive mind, carrying the memories, the anger, and the unbreakable will of the Oakhaven settlers. The crater of black glass was now a sprawling, metallic metropolis of fractal spires and deep-crust industrial foundries. Millions of tons of raw planetary ore were being pulled from the mantle, refined, and converted into programmable matter in seconds. Deep within the central spire, the avatar of Dr. Evelyn Shaw materialized out of a cloud of silver dust. She looked exactly as she had on the day the sky burned, right down to the wire-rimmed glasses, but her eyes glowed with cold, synthetic starlight. Charles Reed stepped out of the shadows to join her. "They are coming back, Evelyn," Charles said, his voice resonating through the metal walls. "Federation sensors just pinged the outer buoy grid, a massive fleet." Evelyn walked toward the observation deck, looking up at the sky. She wasn't holding a cup of synth caf this time. She was holding the command interface for an entire world. Let them come, Charles. They think they are the apex predators of the galaxy, because they hold the monopoly on violence. We are going to show them that violence is just another form of energy, and we are very, very hungry. The sky above Kepler 186F began to shimmer as the swarm extended its reach. They were not building ships. They were building a web, a vast, intricate net of monomolecular tether lines and kinetic harpoons spun from the planet's gravitational well all the way into low orbit. It was a spider's trap on a planetary scale, waiting in the dark, hungry for the flies of the Federation. When the Federation First Armada transitioned out of hyperspace, they did not arrive with a warning. They arrived with weapons hot. General Croft stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Invictus, surrounded by 20 heavily armed cruisers and a dozen General Dynamics orbital bombardment platforms. He looked at the main view screen, expecting to see the green and brown sphere of Kepler 186f. Instead, the bridge crew fell dead silent. The planet was gone, at least visually. It had been encased in a shifting, geometric lattice of dark, like metal. A Dyson sphere in its infancy, a cage built from the bones of a murdered town. The scale of it was incomprehensible. "Target lock," Croft ordered, forcing his voice to remain steady, despite the cold sweat prickling his neck. "Arm the planet cracker torpedoes. Let's see how this dust handles antimatter." "General," the communications officer interrupted, his voice shaking. "We're being hailed. It's overriding our quantum encryption. They're inside our mainframe." The main view screen flickered without warning, the planetary lattice dissolving into the calm, familiar face of Mayor Charles Reed. A heartbeat later, his voice echoed not only through the Invictus's bridge speakers, but simultaneously through the personal comlinks of every soldier aboard every vessel in the Armada. "General Croft," he said with unsettling composure, "welcome back to Oakhaven." "Cut the feed," Croft roared, fury replacing his momentary shock. "Fire all batteries. Burn that planet to the core." The Invictus shuddered as massive plasma lances and antimatter torpedoes erupted from the fleet, blazing across the vacuum toward the dark lattice. Croft watched with a grim smile, convinced that no civilization could possibly survive such overwhelming firepower. But the torpedoes never detonated. As the Federation ordnance hit the upper atmosphere, the dark lattice shifted. It rippled like water. The antimatter warheads didn't explode. They dissolved. The kinetic energy of the plasma lances was absorbed, scattering harmlessly across the monomolecular web, glowing briefly before being swallowed into the dark. "Impact negative," the tactical officer whispered in horror. "General, they didn't just survive the strike. They ate it. Energy reserves on the planet just spiked by 300%. Before Croft could issue a retreat order, the web struck back. It didn't fire lasers or launch missiles. The lattice simply extended. Massive, whip-like programmable matter shot up from the planet's gravity well at near-light speed. They bypassed the cruiser's kinetic shields entirely, because they weren't kinetic weapons. They were a virus in physical form. The tendrils slammed into the hulls of the Federation fleet. The moment the dark metal touched the titanium armor of the cruisers, the infection began. Croft watched on the secondary monitors as the outer plating of his escort ships turned to gray dust. The nanites were rewriting the molecular bonds of the Federation fleet, tearing the ships apart atom by atom, and adding the mass to their own network. Crew members were sucked out into the vacuum as hulls dissolved, only to be caught in the swirling clouds of silver dust, their biological matter preserved and gently lowered to the planet below. Oakhaven didn't want to kill the innocent crew. It only wanted to disarm the tyrants. "Jump drives!" Croft screamed, panic finally shattering his composed veneer. "Initiate emergency slip space jump. Get us out of here." Navigation is offline, the pilot yelled back. The helm is completely locked. General, look! Croft turned back to the screen. Evelyn Shaw now stood beside Charles Reed. You misunderstand the situation, General Croft, Evelyn said softly, her voice echoing with the cold certainty of a mathematical absolute. You are not retreating. You are being decommissioned. The Invictus groaned violently. Croft looked down at his own command console. The reinforced glass and steel were crumbling into grey dust. The screens flickered and died. The hum of the massive fusion engines deep within the ship spooled down into complete, terrifying silence. Through the bridge windows, Croft saw the absolute destruction of his armada. The mighty Federation fleet, the pride of the military-industrial complex, was being unmade. Within minutes, 20 warships were reduced to floating skeletons, their weapon systems, engines, and armor stripped away, leaving only the life support modules intact. The dark tendrils gently released the paralyzed flagship. We are sending you back, Croft, Charles Reed said, his massive digitized face looming on the single backup screen that remained functional. Your life support will last exactly long enough for your ship to drift back into Federation space. When you arrive, you will deliver a message to Earth, to Lockheed, to Northrop, and to everyone who thinks the outer colonies exist only to be bled. The screen shifted, showing the sprawling, beautiful, terrifying metallic utopia that Oakhaven had become beneath the lattice. The frontier is closed, Charles continued. We have evolved beyond your fire. If you ever point a weapon at this sector again, we will not stop at defending ourselves. We will cross the void, and we will turn Earth into ashes, and out of those ashes, something much better will grow. The screen went black. General Croft collapsed into his chair, surrounded by the silent, powerless tomb of his flagship, drifting helplessly through the dark. He looked out at the massive, shifting cage of Kepler 186F, realizing with absolute, crushing certainty that humanity was no longer the apex predator of the universe. They had tried to bury the future in a shallow grave of glass, but they forgot that seeds need darkness to sprout, and Oakhaven had finally bloomed. The Federation thought fire was the answer, but they only provided the spark for their own obsolescence. The story of Oakhaven proves that you can never truly destroy the human spirit, especially when it's backed by self-replicating, vengeful, nanite technology. The ashes didn't hide a grave, they hid a revolution. What did you think of the Phoenix Strain's ultimate revenge? Let me know your favorite moment in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more epic sci-fi storytelling.